So the period from 1930 to about the 1960s or just 1970s was known as cooperative federalism. This is a slightly strange term because quite often this sort of cooperation was the federal government putting pressure on the state governments to do things, as well as the federal government being incredibly sort of powerful. Many Democrat presidents in that period wanted to pass lots of legislation to make people's lives better, even if that legislation might be more properly in the states. So the Health, Education and Welfare Departments were founded in 1953, Transportation Department in 1966. There was a huge increase in categorical grants, a really clear, a really important term rather, but not a very clear one, to be honest, where the federal government would give money to the states but tell them what they had to spend it on. And this period is sometimes described as marble cake federalism because there's lots more being done both by the federal government and the state government, and by the federal government giving money to the state governments to make them do it. So it's a sort of a bit of a muddle and a mix-up really, but lots and lots of government going on. By the late 60s, early 70s, President Nixon felt that the thing needed to change, particularly because the Republican presidents which dominated in this period, Nixon, Ford, Reagan and Bush, largely were in favour of states' rights in principle. So up to a point they tried to reduce the scope of the federal government, tried to cut the deficit, spend less as a federal government, and restore some power to the states. The problem, however, was that they very often didn't want to pay for it, and sometimes they did exercise a lot of federal power to make the states do things they wanted. So this is an era of unfunded mandates at times, as well as block grants. So block grants is when the federal government gives money to the states and lets them do what they want, so that restores the states' powers. But as deficits began to bite and the government in Washington didn't have enough money to spend, they kind of switched and came out with lots of unfunded mandates. It's a sort of coercive federalism in a way, which is where the federal government tells the states what to spend on but doesn't give them the money to spend, so they have to find it themselves. Why is it that federalism changes over this period? Well, one of the main reasons is the country becomes much, much larger, 50 states from the original 13. And so it's much bigger and more complicated, and frankly more important to have coordination well mapped out between the states, with a country that grows both in number of states and number of people massively. Industry advances, and there's quite a lot of increase in trade, commerce and interconnectedness of the economy as a result of this, as well as migration of labour, which argues for common standards, much as the argument we would make the UK benefits from being in a trading bloc with the EU because it's a sort of integrated European economy and therefore must have the same standards, or not, and communication revolution, of course, roads, rail, telephones, telegraph, IT, internet, all these things, as it were, shrink the size of the nation, makes everyone a little bit more homogenous. But the biggest things that cause changes in the relationship between the federal government and the states government are events, particularly major economic events like the Great Depression, or indeed problems of deficits which cause the federal government to not want to spend any money. The Second World War in Britain certainly massively increased the scope of government. because there was a lot of central planning involved in being part of a total war, and that a lot of that sort of central planning and control never really disappeared after the war. Similarly, in America, and the activist Supreme Courts of the Warren and Burger courts massively increased the power of the federal government because these court decisions themselves, allowable under the supremacy clause of the Constitution, meant that the judges at the centre in Washington DC have begun to make laws which told the states what to do against their will, and it relied on the federal government to enforce those things. And the 16th Amendment and some others too have been passed which give the federal government more power. The 16th Amendment allows federal income tax levied by the government, and without that, really the federal government couldn't be anything like as powerful, because in the very old days it rather relied on the states raising money for it, which of course gave the states much more power. And Westbury case that we discussed recently, that's Westbury v Sanders 1964, along with Baker v Carr 1962, both of which dealt with reapportionment and ensuring that congressional districts were equalised for population changes so that they were fair, delinked congressional districts from national districts, and also the arrival of direct primaries meant that no longer in that period after the 1960s did local state politics and state power have the whip hand over how congressmen were elected, and so Congress is a little bit more independent of its local parties. So what's happened more recently in this space, federalism? Well, Obama, a Democrat president, the first for a little bit of time, had this agenda for change, and also was dealing with the fallout from the financial crisis. And although not a particular fan of states' rights, he did in fact funnel a huge amount of the stimulus package through the states, and therefore increased federal assistance to the states for them to spend quite greatly. Some of the state governors were so Republican and states' right that they tried to refuse the money that Obama sent. He also reauthorized SCHIP, Medicaid expansion, and the Race to the Top program. All these programs which he encouraged the states to run, but gave them a lot of money. All these, in a way, were federal power, but in a way were also a great help to the states and gave them the money they wanted to do more. But Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act of 2010, was a huge blow to those people who thought that states should be able to decide things like what kind of healthcare their people had. You see, with things that are more liberal in terms of domestic policy, such as pollution permits for business in California, or the legalization of cannabis for recreational use in Colorado, were things that Obama let happen. So you see in this period really the sort of 21st century, politics really becoming more partisan. So broadly speaking, the Republicans are all in favour of states' rights, except for when the states do things they don't like handgun bans, in which case they seem quite happy for the Supreme Court to pass decisions like DC v. Heller. And similarly, Democrat presidents all in favour of strong federal government and lots of national programs to help people, but are quite happy to return power to the states as long as the states are doing the sort of things that they like. Federalism is the huge framework and theoretical part of this north-south divide, of this tension in the United States political system between very different cultures and histories. This didn't map so much onto party politics in the old days because particularly the Blue Dog Democrats, Southern voters supporting Democrats candidates because that's what they did during the Civil War, meant that there was a considerable degree of right-wing Southern states' rights people in the Democrat Party, which allowed for a little bit of bipartisanship and for Congress to have a myriad of views. But in many ways recently, the country has become more and more polarised in opinion, and broadly speaking, some states are very Republican, very Tea Party, and some states are very left-wing, and the federal government tends to support states' rights only when it suits its political persuasion. The biggest debates about federalism of recent years were over Obamacare, because many governors in many states would wanted to refuse to enact this policy. So many of the advantages of federalism are around the way that it allows a very difficult and complicated society that's very diverse to operate efficiently, that it allows lots of different access to points to government for people, lots of elections, lots of different levels of government, so people can have more of a say, which is sort of pluralism. That by splitting the power of the government between the states and the federal government, that effectively means that individual rights are protected. There's a lovely argument that states can be policy labs, that they can try out things, and if they're successful, the federal government can take them up. And it's true that Massachusetts, for example, had sort of state healthcare, rather like Obamacare, and was used as a model. But very often in this polarized era, what that means is that Democrat states seem to pass laws which are even more Democrat and quite extremely liberal, and Republican red states pass laws or are very strict on immigration or something, which is pretty reactionary. Large countries like the United States, large by geography and population, really do need a federal system, although I suppose information technology makes that less than likely. It is hard to make law in America. On the other side of the argument, it frustrates the national will, having federalism, because there's so many layers of government. Just another source of gridlock, another source of conflict, and another costly bureaucratic system. If you ask anyone what they'd like more of in the world, there won't be very many that say politicians. The UK, as we discussed, does not have a federal system of government, although devolution has made it a little bit more so. So where have we got to? We've got to a situation where the 21st century is one where it's hard to describe federalism. Clearly, there are certainly many presidents of recent times who have thought, in theory, it'd be good to return power to the states, but they found it very difficult to resist actually governing and asking Congress to pass legislation that forces the states to bend to their will. We've seen, I think, a real change that has increased tremendously over the last 20, 30 years, but especially recently, of massive distrust of government generally. This has been a boost to states' rights because people tend to trust local politicians more than they trust national politicians, who they see as a distant elite that's not listening. And we see that economic and technological change has led to a much larger scope for government at the federal level, but you never really see bureaucrats who have power giving that power away. So there's been more government at the centre. That doesn't necessarily mean there's been less at the state level, and yet there's been an increasing distrust in government. So you both have big government in America and a country that hates big government, which is not really the recipe for a happy polity. On that depressing tone, I wish you all the best with this topic.